Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the National Gallery. I'm Gabriele Finaldi. Welcome to those who are in the building and welcome to those who are listening online. I'm very happy to be speaking about Bartolomé Bermejo. This is the first in a series of lectures and events relating to the exhibition which we just opened last week. It is part of our Spanish season, together with the Sorolla exhibition that runs for another month, just a little bit less. Don't miss that if you haven't seen it. These are, in a way, the eyes of Bermejo. It is actually a detail from the great Prado Santo Domingo de Silos. This is St. Dominic of Silos himself. He's the centerpiece of the altar, which is not known in its entirety, but this is the great central panel. And I think you get an idea of what it is that Bermejo's special qualities are from the very beginning as you look at this detail. It's those penetrating eyes, the remarkable focus on detail, every hair of his eyebrows represented, the eyelashes individually represented, the sort of 3-day beard on the saint's cheeks, the hair which appears just underneath his mitre, the way in which the pals are individually rendered with that combination of the highlight and the deeper light that seems to come from inside the pearl itself. Here is an artist who focuses on the fine detail, who has an almost forensic attitude to the way he paints. So if those are the eyes of St. Dominic of Silos, these are the eyes of the terrifying demon at the bottom of the St. Michael, which of course is a National Gallery painting. Those astonishing sort of headlamp orange eyes poking out of his terrifying head. I think we may have a tendency to see this as slightly comical. I think if you really focus on it and you put yourself back, if you can, into the mind of a 15th century viewer, this I think must have been a pretty terrifying sight. Those incredibly sharp teeth, the pointing tongue, those strange kind of pearly ears, that sort of Mars landscape on his head, and the cactus that seems to be growing out of his head as well. But not that, of course, it's snakes everywhere. You've got this sort of metallic effect of his forearm down there on the right. You've got the snakes appearing as the upper part of his limbs. The other sort of headlamp eye you see in the corner here is, of course, one of his nipples, and there are snakes appearing all over the place in the picture. It is incredibly attractive as an image. It draws our attention as we look at the picture. But it is a picture that repays long looking because the details throughout the picture really are very, very remarkable. That's the picture itself. It's a picture that's a relatively recent arrival in the National Gallery's collection. It was acquired in 1995. It had only been in this country really since the very beginning of the 20th century, and for much of its life it was at Luton Hoo. Some of you may remember you could visit Luton Hoo years ago as a sort of historic house that was open to the public. It no longer is. It was the house that was built by Julius Verner at the beginning of the 20th century. He was a South African diamond magnate who had made a large fortune, and he had acquired a very remarkable collection of works of art and paintings too. Some of those can still be seen in Greenwich at the Rangers House. They're of course no longer at Luton Hoo. But in 1995 the St. Michael still was, and I'm delighted that the National Gallery managed to acquire it for its collection. It is a picture that the National Gallery had wanted to acquire for some time, it had its eye on, and it was with great pleasure that we were able to incorporate it into the National Gallery's collections in the mid-90s. We don't have a strong collection of early Spanish painting in the National Gallery, nor indeed do we in this country. Our representation of Spanish painting is fundamentally 17th century. So to acquire a great masterpiece of the 15th century was a very significant move for the National Gallery. We are going to focus principally on the St. Michael during the course of this talk, but I did want to highlight one other very, very significant Spanish picture in a public collection. Most of you will know it. You may not have paid a huge amount of attention to it. It certainly does deserve a lot of attention, and that's the great altarpiece in the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Marshal de Saxe altarpiece, the St. George altarpiece painted in Valencia at the very beginning of the 15th century. It is an altarpiece in its pretty complete state, so you get an idea of the multi-layered character, the large scale of some of these 15th century altarpieces in eastern Spain. That's a total of about 6.5 meters in height. It's in the Raphael room. You may have focused more on the Raphael cartoons, but certainly if you go back to the V&A, don't not spend time looking at this extraordinary large altarpiece from Valencia at the beginning of the 15th century. It is a very remarkable object. And of course, there are one or two other pictures in collections up and down the country, and I'll just start with one of them, which introduces us to the theme of St. Michael, and that's the panel by Gonzalo Peris, who was active in Valencia at the beginning of the 15th century, which is in Edinburgh in the National Gallery of Scotland. St. Michael appears often in 15th century Spanish painting. St. Michael is a good saint to have on your side. He is, of course, the one who weighs souls. He is the one who stands at the side of Christ at the Last Judgment. So it's quite useful to have him, as it were, batting for you. So he's very important as an intercessory saint, a saint that you can pray to, that you can turn to for protection on your last journey. He is also, however, very important as a saint in Spain during the period of the Reconquista. The Reconquista is a long period in Spanish history, but culminates at the end of the 15th century with the taking of Granada in 1492. Gradually, the Muslim kingdoms over the peninsula of Spain were falling to various monarchs, and the Reconquista was completed in 1492. That's how the Spaniards refer to it. And St. Michael clearly is a saint that is felt to be appropriate as the patron saint of the Christian kingdoms who are gradually making their way to the Mediterranean coast, little by little, as it were, taking over the Spanish territories from their Muslim overlords. So St. Michael plays a role as a protector or patron of the Reconquista. The iconography of St. Michael in Spanish painting is very, very interesting. You'll find a sort of combination of St. Michael weighing the souls, you'll find St. Michael attacking the devil, and sometimes a combination of those two. Here are two examples from the 1470s, probably. On the left, the Master of Belmonte in a panel painting in the Metropolitan Museum, where you have St. Michael holding the red cross shield and lowering his spear into the mouth of this horrible demon. You can see some of the elements that you can see in Bermejo's demon as well. This sort of double head, the sort of torso has eyes and teeth as well. And then if you look at the Miguel Jimenez on the right-hand side, you get this very sort of curious sort of mollusk-like, shell-like demon at the bottom of the picture with this sort of sprouting punk haircut with a serpent emerging from it. Clearly, this was a space in which artists were expected to develop their invention and to show just how remarkable their invention could be. And you can see numerous examples. In both these cases, of course, he's winged, and the angel's wings, of course, are also another area where the artist can demonstrate richness of invention. In both cases, of course, the saint is in armor. That's the traditional way in which St. Michael is represented. Here are details of those two demons. And here I felt we couldn't not represent this picture here, although it's slightly late for us. Our picture dates from about 1470. It's commissioned in 1468. But this picture here, which is a couple of decades later, is a very remarkable invention. It comes from a small church in Zafra. Zafra is in Extremadura. It's a town, for example, for which Zurbarán painted rather later on. So Zurbarán would have probably known this picture dating from the 1490s. You can see here it's St. Michael raising his arm with a sword, as he does in our picture, with a crystal shield, and a very remarkable array of monsters and demons, in addition to the main sort of satanic creature at the bottom of the picture. It almost has a Boschian quality to it, and it's perfectly possible that, of course, by this date, Boschian inventions were already well known in Spain. It has a remarkable detail which I think we need to identify, and that is in the crystal shield, you have one of the earliest self-portraits of an artist in Spanish painting. You can just make out the artist dressed in a long robe in red. His right hand is holding the brush to the panel or the surface immediately to his left, and you can see he's holding some sort of palette in his left hand. So the idea of the artist kind of representing himself in a picture which requires a lot of invention, I think is one that's clearly established here. So if you think of those slightly earlier pictures that I was showing as the kind of tradition that Bermejo would have known, it's very interesting to think how different Bermejo's picture is from those. And for Bermejo, you really need to look at examples from Northern Europe. And I've got two examples here. In the center, you have the Memling Last Judgment scene. This is just a detail from it in Gdańsk in Poland, dating from the 1460s, so about the same time as the Bermejo on the left-hand side of this screen. And then on the right-hand side, this is just a detail from a panel you may not have devoted a lot of time to. It's on show in the Sainsbury galleries upstairs by Michael Pacher. Pacher is an artist who comes from the Tyrol and works in Salzburg, so in sort of Lower Austria. And that's a detail from a small panel, and you can see the similarities with Bermejo's saint, I think, are quite noticeable. So, as it were, the matrix that Bermejo seems to be drawing on is only partly Spanish. He does seem to be drawing on the kinds of images that were being produced in Northern Europe rather than only within the Spanish tradition. You can see, for example, in the Memling, and indeed in the Pacher on the right, the saint is wearing contemporary armor. It's, in all three cases, Italian-style armor. And in our own picture, of course, we've included a study of the armor by Toby Capwell, who's the armorer, the curator of armor at the Wallace Collection. It makes fascinating reading when you acquire the catalogue as you leave this lecture. Another suggestion has recently been made by our colleague. He was formerly a curator here, Lorne Campbell, who wanted to draw attention to this enormous sculpture. It's over 5 meters high. This, in fact, is a reproduction of the original, which is now kept in Brussels Town Hall itself. But this contraption was placed on top of the tower of Brussels Town Hall. It acted as a weather vane as well. It was almost certainly, partly at least, designed by Roger van der Weyden, who was the city painter. And I think it is interesting to compare the imagery of the sculpture, probably dating from the 1450s, and it was first commented on as on display in 1455. So plenty of time for some sort of image of it, or some description or some sketch of it being able to reach Spain. I think it's a very interesting element to throw into the mix, but you can see that there are certain features of it which are quite similar. The position of the right leg, for example, the focus on the saint with a sword rather than with rather than with a pair of scales, as you've seen in one or two of the other images, or indeed of a lance and the demon at his feet. It is a very interesting question, that of Bermejo and the relationship with Northern European painting. Of course, this is a moment in which the artists of the Netherlands, beginning with Van Eyck and van der Weyden, of course, are developing a new way of painting, taking full advantage of technical advances in oil painting, and creating some quite remarkable examples of verisimilitude in representation of costume, of skin, and of other textures and surfaces. And Bermejo seems very alive to this, to the point where certain scholars have said he must have spent some time in the Netherlands, possibly in the workshop of Petrus Christus. That's been one suggestion that's been made. He may have had some association with the sort of heirs of van der Weyden. There is no additional evidence for this, and I think we here at the gallery have taken the view that given that there isn't clear evidence for that, we reserve judgment. But we do also say that the strength of Netherlandish painting in Spain, itinerant Netherlanders who were working in Spain, I think is another element to the argument. So you could propose, and indeed that it has been proposed by various scholars, that it wasn't absolutely necessary for Bermejo to travel to the Netherlands to get an understanding of the new technique of oil painting, relatively new technique of oil painting, and the particular way of using it by Netherlandish artists, and indeed Netherlandish artists who were in Spain. We do know of certain Spanish artists, Luis Dalmau being the best documented, artists traveling to the Netherlands on a sort of northern study trip, who then come back and paint in a northern style. The evidence for Bermejo is still lacking. But in fact, we don't have much information at all on Bermejo. He remains a very mysterious character, in spite of documentary findings over the years. So we have a sort of sketchy outline of Bermejo's career. This is a map of Spain sort of during Bermejo's lifetime. You can see it's divided up fundamentally into four kingdoms. The Kingdom of Castile, which includes Leon and includes Andalusia down in the south. That's the main part of Spain. The Kingdom of Granada, which I said was completely conquered by Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic kings, in 1492. Up on the eastern side of Spain is the Kingdom of Aragon, which is made up of several, or the Crown of Aragon, which is made up of several kingdoms. You've got Catalonia, Valencia, Aragon itself, and of course the islands, Mallorca, in the Mediterranean Sea, and then Navarre up at the top. So over the course of Bermejo's lifetime, and thanks primarily to the marriage alliance between Ferdinand and Isabella in 1486, the kingdoms of Spain are brought together. 1492, of course, is the date of the fall of Granada, but it is, of course, as you know, the date of Christopher Columbus's first trip across the Atlantic and the discovery of America, which, of course, becomes incorporated to the Spanish kingdoms. So this is the Spain of Bermejo, and you need to think of Bermejo beginning his career down here in Cordoba, which is in Andalusia, but is part of the Kingdom of Castile. This, of course, was a very important Muslim city, and it's on the Guadalquivir River, which runs down through Seville and comes out at Sanlúcar. However, we know nothing about his formation in the Kingdom of Castile, and all his activity is concentrated in the Kingdom of Aragon. And all the documents that we've found relating to Bermejo relate to his activity in the Kingdom of Aragon. So he first appears here in the Kingdom of Valencia. He then appears a little bit later up here in Derocker. Then he appears in Saragossa. And finally, he's in Barcelona in Catalonia. So all his recorded activity takes place in this area of Spain. Now, were it not for an inscription on the frame of the Pietà, we'd have no idea of his origins in Andalusia. So this inscription, which is part of the original frame, this picture is in the exhibition. It's a very remarkable loan from the Dean and Chapter of Barcelona Cathedral, for which we are enormously grateful. But this inscription, which appears here on the bottom, as though it's carved into the frame, rather like the Van Eyck self-portrait upstairs in our own collection, has the words at the beginning, Opus Bartolomé Bermejo, Cordovensis. So Cordovensis is the genitive, of course, for somebody born in Cordova. He is of Cordova. He comes from that city. And the inscription here is given in Latin, and his name is rendered here as, Bermejo. So this is where we have the information that he comes from Cordova. Otherwise, we'd have no reason to suppose that he has his origins in Andalusia. I think it's proper to say that there's nothing in his known paintings that requires him to have had his formation in Andalusia. Indeed, he may not. He may have simply been born in Cordova and then relatively early on moved to Aragon. We simply do not know. His name appears on several of his pictures, in fact on 3 of them, and here it appears on the frame. In our own picture, it appears on a piece of paper that's fallen to the ground by the feet of St. Michael, and you see it written as though it were written sort of longhand with a quill pen. He appears here as Bartolomeus Rubeus. So we had Bermejo in the frame in the Barcelona picture. Here we've got Rubeus. The trigram of the name of Christ that appears at the top there, IHS, they're the 3 letters that make up Jesus. This was quite common in medieval documents to mark the beginning of a letter or a document with the name of Christ. Some people, even today in Spain, start their letters not with IHS but with a cross at the top of their letter writing. It's fairly common still. And then this beautiful signature with this elaborate flourish at the end. Now, interestingly, when this picture first appears in Britain, it's not understood who this artist is. The connection with the picture in Barcelona only happens later on, and it's assumed very early on here in England that this is by a French artist, not that same Bartolomé Bermejo that we already knew from the Barcelona picture. His name appears again, his signature, at the foot of the Aquiterme triptych, which we also have in the exhibition, and it appears in very, very similar fashion to what we've just seen in the St. Michael. Again, the IHS at the top, Bartolomeus Rubeus. So Rubeus, Bermejo, all of these are variants of Bermejo. Bermejo means red or reddish. Rubeus, red or reddish. And in fact, we'll find that his name also appears in a document, in several documents, in fact, as Cardenes. Well, Cardenes, you can imagine that word being related to sort of cardinal or cardinal red, again, as a reference to that colour. That may be significant. In a sense, it may be representing, or it may stand for some sort of physical characteristic. That's what's usually been assumed. He may have been red-haired. That would have been a distinctive feature and would have been turned into a nickname for him. He may have been ruddy-skinned. We don't know. It may simply be that Cardenes or Cardenes is his surname, and that is adapted to various different formulae in the way the name is used. I think in the 15th century it's fair to say that names were rather more fluid than they were later on. But clearly here's an artist who's placing his name on his pictures. He's an artist who wants to be recognized for his skill. This makes him, I think, relatively modern. He is an artist who has a reputation. It's a reputation that goes across borders within Spain, and he's very keen that his name should be recognized. Here's an artist who feels he has a strong kind of physiognomy of his own. Only about 20 pictures by Bermejo are known. It's a rather small oeuvre. It's a very exquisite oeuvre, and clearly there are pictures which are entirely by the hand of Bermejo, which are very, very high technical quality. There are others where clearly he's involved in the design, but not necessarily all of the execution. But in terms of those pictures that we can consider his own, we are talking no more than about a dozen and a half paintings. One of his relatively early pictures, but again it's difficult to date his works, is this one here, the Death of the Virgin, which comes from Berlin. It's not a signed picture, but clearly the style of the picture is exactly that of Bermejo himself. Now, this is a very interesting picture because I think it can introduce us to the theme of Bermejo's social background. Already in 1926, when Elias Tormo, who writes the first monograph on the artist, is considering his origins, he is already wondering whether Bermejo may have been a converso. A converso is a converted Jew, a baptized Jew. He may be several generations down, as it were, in the sense that already from the 1380s, in Aragon in particular, but Jews were being forced to convert, and we don't know whether Bermejo might have been forced himself to convert or simply he had been baptized by his parents. In other words, that the conversion happened several generations earlier. Nonetheless, it is a very interesting observation. It's one that in 1926 was based fundamentally on the fact that several of his pictures include inscriptions in Hebrew characters. One of them being this one here, and here's a detail of the canopy above the Virgin with these Hebrew letters. Those who know Hebrew tell us that these do not form a word or a sentence. Nonetheless, there is indeed a strong presence of Hebrew lettering in his paintings. There's also a presence of all sorts of other lettering, and you may notice in these azulejos down here in the foreground this repetition of certain letters, which seem to suggest words, but is not always clear that they are intended to be words. I mean, here clearly D-I-O-S, Dios, stands for God, of course, but then when you look at the other letters, it's very difficult to kind of make sense of that, and then it is essentially kind of repeating. This has also led to the theory that he was an artist who was fascinated with secret knowledge, with codes and ciphers, and there's been quite a lot of hard work, possibly largely wasted, on trying to interpret these inscriptions in his pictures, particularly the Latin inscriptions. But another case where we do have a Hebrew inscription that does actually make sense is this one here, which appears on the Christ at the tomb, supported by two angels, where you have this lettering appearing around the base of this beautiful marble tomb. You've got this lettering rather similar to what we've just seen in the Death of the Virgin. This is clearly a very strongly Catholic image. The Christ in the tomb, the blood coming from his side, the relationship with the chalice is very clear. It's very much a Eucharistic image. It's possibly made for a small altar. And the inscription here can indeed be read and indeed translated. And it works out as, through his death, he overcame death. So, fundamental sort of tenet of sort of Pauline theology, through his death, he overcame death on behalf of all humanity. But there are other reasons too for assuming that Bermejo was a converso, and they are fundamentally that he married a conversa. He married somebody called Gracia de Palaciano, and Gracia de Palaciano we know was from a converso family, but more specifically, and this is a fairly recent discovery, We know that in 1486, by which time Bermejo was already no longer in Saragossa, where he probably married in Derocker, near Saragossa, but then moved on probably for work. But anyway, she was brought before the Inquisitional Tribunal in 1486 and was accused of not knowing the creed beyond the first line. So that was taken as a sign that she wasn't properly Christian, that she certainly wasn't an old Christian, and also that she had been carrying out Jewish rites. We don't know the outcome of that trial, but those are the sorts of accusations that were made to conversos. So while they were nominally, this was the accusation, while they were nominally Christian, they were baptized and they participated in the public Christian rites. Secretly, they were practicing Jewish rites, or they were Judaizing themselves. It's also the case that one of his principal patrons, Juan de Loperuelo, who was a merchant in Derocker, a patron of his, was also accused of engaging in Jewish practices. And it's been argued recently that this itinerant career of Bermejo's, you see him moving around the crown of Aragon, may be related to a sort of religious persecution. In other words, as the Inquisition sort of establishes itself in different parts of Aragon, the Inquisition was very much stronger in Castile, but as it establishes itself across the crown of Aragon, an artist like Bermejo, who may well indeed be a converso, is sort of moving on, trying to keep a step ahead. Now, just because Bermejo may have been a converso, it doesn't mean he wasn't sympathetic to the Christian religion. Indeed, he may have been a very devout Christian himself. And while an artist is often working to the instructions of a patron, a picture like this with its very strong Catholic religious character and that inscription, which I'm sure would not have been readily readable to all, could, I think, also suggest that here was somebody who was very interested in the Catholic religion and may well have been a very devout Christian himself. These are things which is very, very difficult to have a firm grasp of because the documentation is very limited. But this is a period which is enormously interesting, with the extension of the power of the Inquisition, with the increasing centralization of royal power following the alliance between Ferdinand and Castile. And Bermejo falls into precisely that moment when centralized power and indeed an anxiety for the purification of the Christian faith is foremost in the minds of the rulers. And of course, this period also coincides with the expulsion of the Jews. And subsequently, of course, later on in Spain, there will be the expulsion of converted Jews and expulsion of converted Muslims as well. And another interesting fact, which we'll come onto slightly later, is his relations with his last known patron, Luis Desplat, the Archdeacon of Barcelona Cathedral. I think is also very interesting in that it sort of fits into this pattern of the artist sort of moving ahead of the Inquisition, or indeed looking for protection. Luis Desplat was virulently anti-Inquisition and may have brought Bermejo to Barcelona and kept him, as it were, under his protection. But let's go back to 1468 and the commission for the St. Michael. The St. Michael was made for a small town called Tous, like T-O-E-S, but actually spelled T-O-U-S, near Valencia. And you can just about make out here on this tourist map, Embalse de Tous. Embalse means the Tous reservoir. There's Valencia. You remember where this was on the larger map of Spain. I'd also point out here Xàtiva, or Xàtiva. So this was, as it were, the principal town, and Tous was sort of more related to Xàtiva than it was particularly to Valencia. Those of you who have visited the Sorolla exhibition will also be familiar with some of his views of Javea. So you can see that all this area sort of brings Sorolla and Bermejo together. And in fact, some of you will know the work of the great Baroque painter José Ribera, also represented in the National Gallery's collection. Well, Ribera actually came from Xàtiva and then from Valencia, probably headed off for Italy. But anyway, it's for Tous that this picture is made, as we subsequently discovered. And it was made for this man here, who was Lord of Tous. And we know this because of a document that, amazingly, was found in here. Imagine if you forgot the reference where the document was. Fortunately, we didn't, and I'm very pleased to say that the archive of in Valencia, and the Colegio del Patriarca, which houses the notarial archives of the Kingdom of Valencia, has very kindly lent us the notarial document which records the payment to Bermejo for our picture of St. Michael. You can have a good look at it in the exhibition, but I did think it was useful to just compare the first words of this document. So this is a notarial copy of a document, a signed document, where Bermejo is receiving a down payment for an altarpiece devoted to St. Michael. My colleague Letizia Treves, who has curated this show, has put it all together very, very beautifully for us. And you can see the transcription here of the document. So right up there beginning, Eadem die et anno, same day and year as the previous document, 5th of February 1468. And there, of course, is our man, Ego Bartolomé de Cardenas, pictor, painter, citizen of Valencia, receives from Antonio Juan, or Antonio Juan, or Antoni Juan, who is living at this time in Valencia, a down payment of £16 for a picture which is for which the original contract, that unfortunately we haven't found yet, we're looking hard, for £50. So we can assume that the original contract probably dates from late 1467 or very early 1468, and this is the record of the first down payment. We can't be sure that at this stage he had already begun working. It's perfectly possible that he had. So this brief document gives us a lot of information about our picture, and we're very, very fortunate indeed to have it. It's helped us to understand the picture a lot better. It mentions Antoni Juan, or Antonio Johan, depending which source you use. Now, we know quite a bit about Antonio Juan, Antoni Juan, and again, if you read the catalogue, there's a very interesting essay that gathers together all the information that we have about Antonio Juan. He was Lord of Tous. He was a knight, and that's perfectly apparent here because he holds this large sword. He was a businessman too. He was involved in maritime trade. Of course, the Kingdom of Valencia is, well suited to maritime trade. He was very successful in creating alliances with the rulers of Aragon, in the first instance Juan II, whom he accompanies in battle. So he is a knight who fights. And then subsequently with Fernando, that's Fernando and Isabella, who gives him permission to build a quay in the port of Valencia. And that quay provides him essentially with vast income from all the duties of cargoes and goods coming through the port of Valencia. In a document from later than this, Antonio Juan is referred to as a rich and opulent knight, and I think that concurs perfectly with the image that we have of him here. You can see that he's dressed in a very, very fine piece of cloth, beautifully shaped. You can see that Bermejo has been very careful to represent the sort of stitching at the edge, the cuffs, the undergarment, the cap he's wearing. You can see this great insistence on the fine detail, which is Bermejo himself, but no doubt following the close instructions of Antonio Juan himself. Antonio Juan was probably born in the 1430s, so we must assume here that he's being shown, in his late 30s, probably, possibly early 40s. The other thing that we can tell about Antonio Juan, I'll come on to that in a moment. Here is his portrait, and it's very interesting that in Spain in the 15th century it was felt that there weren't good portrait painters, so portrait painters had to be imported, usually from northern Europe. Clearly, Bermejo has skill as a portrait painter, and indeed we have his 3 portraits in our exhibition, so you can see 3 of his patrons as portrayed by Bermejo himself. But clearly he didn't specialize in making individual portraits, which were the kind of thing that the court, whether it was in Valladolid or elsewhere in Spain, it was an itinerant court, required. He didn't really produce those sorts of portraits. Antonio Juan was lord of Toes, which was a small town on the banks of the river Júcar. And this is what the town looked like earlier on in the 20th century. This is the large parish church. It looks to be a 16th century church. So I imagine the church for which the St. Michael had been made was probably an earlier version of this church here. That document does in fact say that it was made as a retaulo, a retable, an altarpiece for the church in Toes. You can see that the river is perilously close to the church, and that really was the downfall of Toes. So that's the church from which the picture would have been removed at the end of the 19th century before turning up in London and being acquired by Julius Werner. This is a photograph probably from the 1920s showing the facade of the church. It's clearly quite a large church with sort of quite imposing facade, but with cut stone only on the portal and at the bottom, and you can see this tall sort of Renaissance style tower built over the top. Now, at a certain point in the 20th century, it's decided that the Júcar River will be dammed. I don't mean it in that sense. A dam will be placed on the Júcar River, and that will lead to the flooding of the town. And so the town was moved in the late 1960s to its current location, which is about 10 kilometers away. And when it was flooded, clearly the town disappeared under water. But every now and then, when the water level in the Toes reservoir drops, and you can see normally it would sort of be at that sort of level, you can tell from the look of the coast, as it were. Every now and then, the top of the tower appears. And in fact, you can even visit it on a boat. Anyone wanting to do further research on Bermejo in Toes would have to don scuba gear. But this is the alarming appearance every now and then of the Church of Toes from which this altarpiece came. On one of the occasions where the reservoir waters went right down to ground level, the new town of Toes decided that they'd rapidly remove the portal, or what bits of it they could remove, and it's been rebuilt in modern Toes. So just as you approach modern Toes, that's the thing that welcomes you. And in fact, you can see that the sculpture of St. Michael, that had already been rescued, also appears there in the portal of the church. So we assume, I think we have every reason to, that inside this church, at the top end of the nave, was the altarpiece that Bermejo painted. However, we don't know very much more about it than that. I'll come on to that in just a moment. The memory of our picture in Toes is strongly felt. And you can see here's a painted wall in modern Toes, which rather curiously mixes our picture here with Botticelli. And this is one of the angels that were recently discovered in Valencia Cathedral. Very, very remarkable. And here's a bit of Picasso. And even more recently, this is a painting that was commissioned for the modern parish church of Toes, where you see the artist has copied our picture exactly on a piece of canvas and stuck it onto a much larger surface with these two children looking up, these strange doves on sticks, and some images of the angel himself. But anyway, you can see that the sort of memory of St. Michael is strong in recent times. I think really Bermejo pulls out all the stops for this picture and shows what he can do. He must have been a fairly mature artist by this date, but we know nothing of any works that precede this. And you can see the invention is remarkable. For example, this reflection of this heavenly Jerusalem on the breastplate of the angel, the remarkable rendition of the red lining, the sort of silk lining of this amazing cloak that he's wearing, the presence of these cut stones, gems, and pearls. It is an absolute tour de force of painting against this beautifully tooled gold background. We haven't talked much about the invention of the devil, but I think that's clear to see how here's an artist who is bringing together, creating this sort of synthetic creature with bat's wings and butterfly wings and bits from insects and other animals, and setting it on this very sort of naturalistically rendered piece of earth with this great variety of flowers and grasses. I was saying before that in addition to knowing that Antonio Juan was a knight and was a wealthy merchant, he was also clearly very devout, or at least that's what he wanted us to think, because here he is praying to St. Michael. Clearly, if there's somebody who understands about alliances, that's a warrior, and the alliance with St. Michael, who's the most powerful warrior of them all, is very, very valuable. And of course, what St. Michael will do is he will carry Antonio Juan's prayers to heaven and thereby smooth the path for his welcoming into the kingdom. And we know exactly what it is he's praying because the lettering on his prayer book is perfectly readable. You can see a capital M there, Miserere me, Deus. This is the beginning of Psalm 50. And then on the other side, from the depths to you I cry, which is Psalm 130. These are both well-known penitential psalms, often associated with funeral liturgies, and which are recited when one is praying for a loved one who's passed away. So he is praying very clearly to Christ, as it were, via St. Michael, with the hope that at the end of his earthly journey he will be taken to the heavenly Jerusalem as represented on the breastplate of the saint. We don't know, however, what this altarpiece looked like, this retaulo that appears in the document, but we have got some clues in as much as we can compare it with other retables from the time. No complete retable by Bermejo survives. We know a little bit about the Santa Engracia altarpiece. This is a central panel from an altarpiece he paints for Derocker near Saragossa in the mid-1470s. So there's the titular saint. She's an early Christian martyr from Saragossa. And around her were other scenes, and we know some of them. This one, for example, is in Bilbao. This one is still in Derocker, and you can sort of recreate the ensemble that makes up the altarpiece of Santa Engracia. This panel is not that different in size from the St. Michael, so it may well be that the St. Michael was the centerpiece of an altarpiece of this kind. Here are some Valencian altarpieces, specifically from Xàtiva, so not far from Tours, dating from the second half of the 15th century. And they give you an idea of what altarpieces in that area at this time would have looked like. So here, almost certainly, you would have had a sculpted figure at the center. Here you can see that there would have been some kind of carved canopy over the top. You've got two saints in this case, either side. You've got the banco or predella, and then what Spaniards call the guardapolvo, this sort of framing element around the outside. Usually altarpieces had a crucifixion, normally at the top, sometimes down here at the bottom, and then sometimes in Valencian altarpieces you have a space at the bottom for a tabernacle. Here's another example, slightly later, but still sort of close in date to Bermejo. Here you can see that the crucified Christ appears in the banco. At times you had two saints. Sometimes altarpieces or chapels had double sort of devotional patronships. And then you'll see that around the main scenes were usually narrative scenes of some kind. There you can see there's an Ascension there, here's the Resurrection. So we can assume, I think, that the St. Michael was something like that. And it was suggested some years ago by a distinguished scholar of Bermejo's work, somebody called Judith Berg, Sabri, that 4 panels, which are in our exhibition, which are in Barcelona, may have been the panels that went with the St. Michael. That's this one here, the descent of Christ into Limbo on the left, and Christ with the Old Testament patriarchs having made their way into the entrance to paradise and showing them an image of the crucified Christ so that they can make an act of faith, as it were, in front of it. These are quite remarkable panels. There are 2 more here. They sort of constitute a sort of quartet. Here's the Resurrection, and then there's the Ascension. It seemed quite a reasonable idea that these 4 panels might go with our St. Michael, particularly because you'll notice that there's a presence of an angel in every single one of them. Here, and then here, and then here. So the proposal that was made was something like this, with the main image in the center and then the narrative scenes on the outside. However, that doesn't really work, and I'll explain why in a moment, but not before showing some pretty amazing details of these panels, which you can look up you can look at very closely in the exhibition. Here are the just of the Old Testament who are being greeted by Christ as he makes his way down into the underworld. Here's Adam and Eve, King David here with the crown. This is a rather interesting figure, and I suspect may well be a portrait. I wonder if that may not be Bermejo himself, or anyway, the patron of these particular works. And you can see in that scene of the harrowing of hell the extraordinary demons. So he's got a thing for demons, and he does them fantastically well, and you can compare them with the demon in the St. Michael itself. And then here in the scene of the Resurrection, you get again that effect of the crystal shield that St. Michael is holding. This is the reason why the Berg Sabri proposal doesn't quite work, and that is that these were 2 panels that were paired together, so they were paired horizontally and not vertically. We now know this thanks to the work that's gone on around our exhibition and 2 previous exhibitions at the Prado and Barcelona. So those panels would appear to have formed the banco of an altarpiece, and I have to say, even if you put them with our St. Michael, you have, I think, a real problem of scale. These are enormous panels for a St. Michael, which is not actually that large. We're still thinking about this problem, as are all the Bermejo specialists, and the most recent proposal is that those 4 panels go with this picture here, which is the great masterpiece of Bermejo's in the Prado Museum. You'll recognize the face from the very first slide I showed you. This is the centerpiece of the great Santo Domingo de Silos altarpiece made for Derocker in the mid-1470s, with its remarkable original Gothic canopy and the Gothic side elements as well. It is an astonishing piece of painting, an astonishing piece of invention, where the throne of St. Dominic looks like Milan Cathedral, and you've got these representations of virtues and so on. And that's the suggestion for how the whole thing might go together. But as I say, this is just a suggestion for the time being, and I hope that as we progress in our understanding, we'll have a clearer sense of how these works all fit together. But I'm delighted that we can show them in the exhibition, and they're there for all to enjoy. In the early 1470s, in spite of the date that we have down there, he's painting also for an Italian patron, and this is why the Aquiterme triptych ended up in northern Italy, near Alessandria, in a cathedral there. And once again, we're very grateful to the cathedral authorities of Aquiterme for lending this picture to us. This may well be quite close in date to the St. Michael from possibly the early 1470s. But Francesco della Chiesa, who appears here, is demonstrating his devotion to the Virgin Mary, in particular to the Virgin of Montserrat. Montserrat being the great shrine of the Virgin outside Barcelona, which is very important for the whole of eastern Spain. Montserrat means the sawn mountain, and that explains the very curious iconography of this picture, where the Virgin Mary is sitting rather uncomfortably, I have to say, on this saw. But that is nothing to do with St. Joseph or the carpenter's shop. It is to do with the devotion to Santa Maria de Montserrat. And clearly, Francesco della Chiesa had a devotion to this particular devotion to the Virgin, and wanted that recorded in his chapel for whenever it was that he was going to be buried back home. That happened some decades later, actually. It is a remarkable painting and shows how, at the same time as he's producing the St. Michael, he's also experimenting with these remarkable sort of skyscapes and landscapes, and sort of introducing, as it were, the whole world into the background of his pictures. There's the portrait of Francesco della Chiesa, a very, very wealthy merchant whose business interests were fundamentally in Valencia, who was involved in shipping and merchant activities of various kinds. And there he is praying to the Virgin. Once again, his prayer is perfectly readable. It's the Salve Regina, the greeting to the Virgin Mary. And of course, the Virgin Mary is also, like St. Michael, a very effective protector. Here are some details from the background. Once again, I recommend that after this talk you spend some time looking at the detail of these pictures. It is very remarkable, and you can compare some of the details from the Aquiterme triptych with details in our own painting. Our own painting, of course, has recently been the object of a very remarkable restoration, and I think we've been able to recover, thanks to the work of the team here, Paul Ackroyd in particular, the original appearance, or as close to the original appearance as it's possible to achieve. I'm going to finish with the Pietà, and sure enough, this is the last painting that we know by the artist. He may have produced paintings after this. He certainly produced designs for stained glass windows, one of which survives actually in Barcelona Cathedral. So under the protection of Luis Desplat, who appears there on the right, the archdeacon of the cathedral, he was given the opportunity to produce different sorts of things from what he had produced up to that point. This is a very remarkable altarpiece. It's not a composite altarpiece. It's not a triptych like the Aquiterme triptych. It is a single panel, and I suspect that from its shape, it was made for a very specific space. And we know that Desplat's quarters were in the tower adjacent to the cathedral. And it's almost certain that this painting comes from his quarters, probably his private chapel, where he would have knelt, as he appears in this painting, praying before the dead Christ being held by the Virgin in the company of St. Jerome. St. Jerome, of course, is the patron saint of priests. He's also the patron saint of learned theologians. And clearly, the patron would have felt a close association with St. Jerome. And here, once again, you see this extraordinary kind of laying out of this wild landscape where you have cities, rivers, roads, hermitages, mountains. You even have sort of meteorology with this sort of sense of, a storm on this side of the picture and then a sort of clearer sky on the other. So an artist who really likes to kind of spread his interests across the surface of this picture, while of course focusing on this extraordinarily tragic rendition of the Pietà and dating from 1490. There's another detail, this fascinating representation of body hair. It is something that the artist takes a very, very particular interest in. It is something very specific to Bermejo. You may like to examine that. And there's the sort of slightly glum-looking Louis Desplats. But Louis Desplats was a learned man. He was a man with serious archaeological interests. He was clearly a man with sort of deeply cultivated, and somebody who recognized in Bermejo somebody who could, as it were, put into imagery the interests which he had. But that's the work that, as it were, completes our exhibition. And I think with the selection that's been made for the exhibition, you can get a very clear sense of the artist's achievement. We are very proud to be able to call him a great artist of the Spanish Renaissance, and you're very welcome to go and have a look at that exhibition in Rouen. Thank you for your attention.